Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies U.S. History series with part 2 of Western expansion in the late 1800s and the quote-unquote Native American experience. So, when we last left off, tensions between the Plains Native Americans and the U.S. government were extreme. While many submitted to being forced onto the reservations, as we said, some would fight back. Today, we will look at that violence and the government's attempts at assimilation. Key term here, and we'll have to ask ourselves, was this the end of the final frontier? And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a wide variety of materials are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link below this video. So let's start with some context on some of the violence we talked about in part 1 and how the U.S. government had built up a legacy of broken treaties with the native population. In 1851, they signed what's called the Fort Laramie Treaty, and this created a reservation for the Plains tribes, including the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho. So where we left off was with what's called the Sandy Creek Massacre of 1864. Where a band of Cheyenne and Arapaho was attacked by the U.S. Army. Estimates of the dead vary, but most historians agree the number of dead was around 150 to 250, two-thirds of which were women and children. Now, settler and military presence had increased dramatically in Colorado since the discovery of gold there in 1859. And we will see this to be a trend. If gold is discovered on or near native lands, well, you know the outcome. In what is often referred to as the Plains Indian Wars, which was really just a series of violent interactions from Sand Creek until around 1890, and included other conflicts like the Great Sioux Wars and the Dakota Wars. And today, as most tests do, we will look at the Sioux in more detail. As I mentioned, the Sioux, and there were multiple Sioux tribes, including the Lakota Sioux, who will play a big role in our lesson today. And as I mentioned, the Sioux provided the ultimate example of broken treaties and resistance for the last of the final frontier. The Sioux, with leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, would captivate a nationwide audience and represent some of the most infamous events of this quote-unquote taming of the Wild West. So, as you can see from this map, the Fort Laramie Treaty created a Sioux reservation, which was in parts of present-day Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. But we touched on this last time, not all Sioux tribes were alike. And from the beginning, some members disregarded the borders that the government had created for them. In 1862, a band of Sioux in Minnesota, upset by what they claimed was the government's failure to provide promised food rations on their reservation, massacred hundreds of settlers. And in return, the government arrested and hanged 38 members of the tribe. So we see the violence expanding. The Sioux agreed to a new treaty in which they promised to settle in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which a land that had long been considered a holy site to the tribe. Well, while the Sioux were away in the Black Hills, the railroad company hired men to kill the buffalo as they were considered a nuisance to their construction. This move not only disseminated the food source of the Plains Native Americans, but hunting buffalo for many of the Great Plains tribes had been the center of their existence and culture for thousands of years. In 1874, gold was discovered in South Dakota, the last little bit of the Sioux reservation. And again, you can probably imagine what comes next. Our first interaction is the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 on the Crow Reservation in present-day Montana. Better known as Custer's Last Stand, the legendary Colonel George Armstrong Custer was tasked with tracking down a quote-unquote renegade band of Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. A band under the spiritual guidance of Sitting Bull and military leadership of Crazy Horse. In what represented the most demoralizing loss for the U.S. Army and the Western campaign, Custer's entire company was wiped out during the battle. Again, this was the most decisive military victory for the Plains Indians, and it has come to represent the ultimate example of native resistance. As news of the battle reached Eastern newspapers, political pressure was placed on the government to act. The Battle of Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand, has been well documented, and its historical significance continues to be examined to this day. For the legendary natives who participated in this battle, things did not go as planned. Crazy Horse was killed in captivity, and Sitting Bull fled to Canada, where he did find some peace for a while. As interest in Native Americans started to explode, they almost became a form of entertainment, and even performed in the Buffalo Bill shows that traveled the United States, reenacting episodes from the frontier. So, as the 1880s were coming to an end, we need to cover the Dawes Act, which is often on these tests. And the first thing you want to look for in your answer choices is the word assimilate. A reminder, the Oxford Dictionary defines assimilate to absorb and integrate people, ideas, or culture into a wider society or culture. So there were reformers who were looking for ways that the native population could assimilate. And Congress attempted to do just that by passing the Dawes Act. Historians still debate whether Senator Henry Dawes, who introduced the bill, had good intentions, but nonetheless, it passed in 1887. Before we get into the details of the Dawes Act, and while we're on the topic of assimilation, we'll cover another benchmark by looking at a governmental policy put in place at the same time as the Dawes Act. In a two-pronged approach, the government embarked on a mission to assimilate by creating boarding schools for Native children. One infamous one, the Carlisle School's mission, was to, quote-unquote, kill the Indian to save the man. So another key term you want to keep your eye out for is Americanize, which is what it sounds like, the government's attempts to assimilate or turn natives into Americans. The Dawes Plan would attempt to do this by turning natives into capitalists. They would turn reservations into private individual lots, turning natives into property or homeowners. The native population was expected to farm their lots, but many Plains natives had little experience with farming. The native population in this agreement usually got infertile, unwanted desert land. Shocker. And many desperate and starving natives ended up selling their lands either back to the government or to land speculators, bringing huge profits to investors. The results, the native population lost 90% of their land, which pretty much spelled the end of the final frontier, as now it had been divided into privately owned lots. But we'll come back to that thought. To add insult to injury, 3 years after the Dawes Act was passed was the Battle of Wounded Knee, aka the Wounded Knee Massacre. The ghost dance movement I mentioned before raced through the reservation system, from reservation to reservation, in which ritualistic dances, which could sometimes carry on for days, were practiced in a belief that it would restore the native lifestyle. The military, I guess a little freaked out by these rituals, decided to disarm the natives on the reservation near an area called Pine Creek in South Dakota. There was some debate about who shot first, but in the end, somewhere between 150 to 300 Native Americans were killed. To most historians, Wounded Knee represented the end of the final frontier. By 1890, the number and size of reservations would only continue to dwindle. So what is this quote-unquote Native American experience that we are expected to know? As you could tell, it's too complex to be told as one story, but for our purposes in our exam, we want to focus on what was happening to Native Americans during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And what we witnessed was the end of the traditional Native American lifestyle, the ending of the final frontier. Now we have another complex question on the legacy of the treatment of Native Americans. Another one of those stains on American history that has never been fully addressed. This legacy has been marked by colonization, forced relocation, cultural assimilation, and systematic discrimination. And yet it plays a significant role in the folklore of the development of the United States. So, was this shocking savagery or genocide, as some said? We know the Native American experience was not some simple individual story to tell, and the scholarship and experience are still studied and debated to this day. Americans' obsession with the final frontier and cowboy and westerns, where native population was usually portrayed as the enemy, turned out to be a major form of entertainment. But it often masked the reality of the harsh legacy of the quote-unquote Indian experience, a legacy that continues to be written. And that is it. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe, because up next we will be looking at economic changes of farmers and the rise of a political movement called populism. Just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a wide variety of materials are available at Teachers Pay Teacher. Just click the link below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teacher.